How's that? I want to, Laura and I were talking about something during the break, and I wanted to show you a process because I need to share with you that many therapists have said to me that they thought I make it very difficult for people who come to see me because I talk about perfection. And what is clear to me is that people, apparently I don't always make clear what the process is. But for the moment, let's think of this as being your perfect self. That's, if you were being exactly who you really are all the time, this is what you would be. Well, you are. You're that all the time. When you're being an asshole, that's when you're not being who you are. You get what I'm saying? That's when, I've erased the part here, the cold and the hot. What is hot when it's not there? It's cold, isn't it? By the way, I grew up on a farm in western Kansas, and before any kind of electricity, not even wind chargers. And when we had to go out to the barn at night, we'd light a lantern. And I can still see my dad. In fact, I've done it myself. You light a lantern, and you carry it on that wire beside you, and you walk, and you swing the lantern. And I got to thinking one day when I was a kid, I thought of this. Does a lantern know what dark is? No. And then you get in the barn, and you're no longer walking and swinging it. Now you want to push the dark back further. So you hold the lantern up here, and it pushes the darkness away. It's kind of like a fish doesn't know what water is, does it? Now, here we are. This is your perfect self. The trouble is you don't know what that is. You don't even know what your perfect self is. We struggled just to get those words on there, didn't we? Now, how do you account for your behavior if you're this? See, your behavior is down here, isn't it? So let me show you how the two different ways to approach perfection. One of them is the religious approach is that you're supposed to strive to get up here as far as you can, knowing that you'll never make it, and then hope that God fills in the gap. But you never know how much He's willing to fill in. Now, the approach I'm suggesting is you're already here. Now you're bringing your behavior up here. You're already there. Now you're learning how to bring your behavior into alignment with the truth of your being. And by the way, every single thing I say about you in regard to this is true of your supervisor. Every single thing I'm saying is true. So, it's just like the basketball player. He envisions himself as the perfect shooter. Now he's bringing his muscles and his skill into play to realize as much of that as he can. But if he doesn't make it any further than that, there's nobody says, well, you dumb ass, you didn't do the best you could. Nobody's saying that to you. So what I'm getting at here is to work out of your perfect self does not put the heat on you because you are perfect. And when you're acting otherwise, it's because you're not being this, you've slipped back into this. And that's okay. That's okay. You get to experience it again. Our oldest daughter, I hope she'll forgive me for saying this, but she's past 45 already. But of our 4 children, she's been my most effective critic. And when she come back from college, she said after she graduated from college, she said to me one time, she says, Dad, she says, you gave us so much freedom that then we felt so loyal to you that we couldn't break the apron strings. And I said, well, then in that case, I suppose breaking the apron strings is your job. She says, see, you won't even apologize. I said, no. I said, I'm not going to apologize for doing the best I know how. It's not very good, but it's the best I had. Well, she and her husband is a pilot, and they were in Kansas. Now, for the last 7 years, they've been back out here, and we've seen a lot of each other. And just recently, her husband volunteered to fly out of Hong Kong to Delhi, India, for 3 months. So she went with him, and they lived in Hong Kong. They just got home 2 weeks ago today. It's the neatest thing. It's the neatest thing. Now, she and I have worked out a lot of things. In fact, one of the things that happened was when they moved back. Well, I have to tell you this story before you understand that. We went to visit them in Kansas, and their kids were playing ball out in the yard. And I went out and played with them, and I noticed that this is the way. Now, their dad is a pilot and a wonderful musician. But he hasn't taken to sports very much, excepting some individual sports like fencing and some things like that. But when it comes to baseball and basketball, he hasn't been all that good a coach for them. And I noticed the kids were throwing the ball like this. And so I said, hey, kids, let me show you something. I said, if you will step off with the opposite foot from the one you throw with, you get your whole body into it. You can throw harder and more accurately and faster. And so after a while, I went in the house, and my daughter said, you know, Mike saw what you were doing out there, and we just want you to know we really appreciated that. And then she said, why didn't you do that for me when I was learning that? And I said, well, what did I do? She says, well, all you ever told me is I threw like a girl. I said, Bonnie, I made lots of mistakes, but that was not one of them. I would have never. It was just an hour before this that she told me. She says, Dad, I must give it to you. You never told me I couldn't do something because I was a girl. I mean, she said that an hour earlier. Now she's saying, you just said I threw like a girl. I said, Bonnie, in my worst moments, I wouldn't have said anything like that to you. You sure did. Then they moved back, and after they'd been back here 2 or 3 months, one day she said, Dad, you're not at all like I remember you. Because I really was a perfect dad when she was younger, and she didn't know that. But here, I want to explain something here. Kids take authority as authority, no matter where it comes from. Teachers, neighbors. I put it this way, everybody has to forgive their parents, not necessarily for what they did, but for what we think they did. The word forgiveness, by the way, which has really been a tough one for me, because for so many years I treated it as though I will allow you to be a stupid ass, you know, and not hold it against you. Now I find out that's not what it means at all. About 7 or 8 years ago, I discovered that forgiveness means I will release my judgments of good or bad about who you are. See, when kids, when I first learned to know them, quite often, you know, they'd lie to me. I was an officer of the court, and they'd lie to me, and I always say to parents, when your kids lie to them, best thing in the world is believe them. There's nothing trips a kid up quicker than believing his lie. But you see, we therapists and parents and school teachers and everybody want to be so sharp. We just see through those kids. We can just read them like the back of our hand. We know when they're lying, you know. And all we do is we set ourselves up to look like judges. You believe a kid, and then pretty soon the thing falls apart, and you say, oh, I'm confused here. I thought you said this. And the kids would say quite often to me, yeah, but I was lying. I said, oh, did it work? They'd say, no. I said, well, would you like to discuss an alternative? And now they're open to it. You see, you're not the judge who's or the policeman or something like that all the time. Now, back to this idea of perfection. The thing that I want you to know is that when you once shift your identity from here to here, then when you get back into this, all you're simply recognizing is, I'm not being who I am. Remember the basketball player? What does he do when he misses? Choose again. Give me the ball. Let me try it again. That's all that means. That's all that means, folks. By the way, that's what the word sin meant. Now, religiously, we've done a lot of things with that, but the word sin meant to miss the mark. You get the picture of the archer shooting at the bullseye, and if he was too far away and he couldn't see very good, he'd have a servant stand over to the side and to let him know how close he was. So he'd shoot at the bullseye, and if he missed, the servant would yell back, "Sin!" Now, did that mean that he was supposed to get down on his knees and confess? Or did it mean take another arrow and shoot it? See if you can do better this time. And that's what we're doing here. We're just simply saying, I goofed. I didn't do it. I didn't do that very good. It's not demanding that you... See, when you get to the place where you're doing it perfect every time, you belong on some other plane. You're done with this place, whatever that means. I don't know what that means. So I just wanted to be clear on that, because when I talk about being perfect, I have a Presbyterian minister, a friend of mine, who will say to me, he says, "Don't say perfect." See, we're afraid. We're afraid of that. It's like the police used to say to me when I was working with juvenile delinquents. They'd say, "Boy, you're idealistic." I'd say, "Yeah, I suppose so." I said, "Should I lower my ideals?" "Well, no, don't do that." "Well," I said, what do you want me to do?" You see, if I lower my ideals and I say, "I'll settle for this," what if I get there? I'm not happy and I'm settling for the good instead of the best, right? But if I don't judge myself for not getting here, I said, I've got a lot to learn yet. That's just the process. The picture, the image I hold in my mind, if we settle for imperfection, you see, if you're looking for the perfect husband or the perfect wife or the perfect boss or the perfect company to work for, they're figuring it out too. On our 45th wedding anniversary, Helen and I have been married 48 years. On our 45th wedding, it fell on Sunday. So Helen and I just took 2 stools and got up on the stage and sat down, and we let everybody there ask us questions about our marriage. You know, one of the I don't remember the question, but I'll always remember one of Helen's answers when she said, in response to a question, she said it this way. "Well," she said, "we've learned that the more we set each other free, the more we want to be together." And I believe that in the workplace, there can be a wonderful, wonderful experiment in how to set each other free. Because I'm convinced that being totally free... See, our society believes... we don't realize to what extent we've been influenced by theologians from the past. Our courts, our schools, our businessmen, generally speaking, set a man free and he will do wrong. I've worked with the schools. As I told you before, I was the first school social worker they had. And one of the things that came up, maybe, I'm a storyteller, right? Have you figured that out? I remember I went to one of our high schools here in the county, and I found out they had made a rule that the boys couldn't wear beards. This is back in the 70s. So I went to the assistant principal, and I said, now wait a minute here. Let's see now. The hair that grows naturally on this boy's face, there's something wrong with that, right? Well, he says, "Don't you believe in neatness?" I said, "Yeah, so why don't you make a rule about neatness? Why did you make it about beards?" Well, he says, "How are you going to enforce that?" oh, I get it. I said, you'd rather have a rule, a stupid rule that makes no sense that you can enforce, rather than have an intelligent rule that makes sense that's hard to enforce. Is that what you're telling me? He says, Paul, if we let this kid do it, we're going to have to let them all do it. I said, they don't all want to do it. They don't all want to do it. This is what really amazes me, is when one person does something, we think everybody's going to go do that. We're not that much sheep. If we can, and by the way, it isn't just the supervisor's job to set you free. In fact, there is no supervisor that can set you free. I said to a whole group of people one day, I said, every woman in this audience ought to declare her freedom. And to my surprise, half the audience broke out in applause. I didn't realize what a hot issue it was. But when I decide in my shower in the morning that I am free, do you know something? That means that I cannot have my freedom if I deprive you of yours. There is no such thing as freedom at somebody else's expense. There's nothing left for me to do but to be considerate. There's nothing left for me to do but to understand what you're up against from your perspective, from your side of that thing. And that's going to lead us into what I'm going to begin with 2 weeks from tonight when I get into that. I want to talk about the 5 principles of communication with this as our background. It's so important to me that not only can we create our context each day, but that even in my talking to you, I have to create a context, or else what I'm going to say afterwards makes no sense. So I've decided to spend 3 hours creating context. I said in my outline I was going to spend an hour on it, but I realized that I wanted, maybe I've put too many ideas up here, I don't know. But it's very important to me that if we really want to experience the joy of life. You know, I decided many years ago, well, let me put it this way. I was talking to a personnel manager of the Hewlett-Packard Company in another place. How's that? Is that diplomatic enough? And I was getting ready to do a workshop there, and he said, now don't talk to us about this love stuff. And I said to him, I said, wait a minute. I said, take love out of, and by the way, he has maybe I don't know all the details, but I think he has a very loving relationship with his wife and kids. And I said, take love out of the home, and what do you got? Don't you have a torture chamber? Take love out of your social relationships, and what have you got? What do you think you have if you take love out of the workplace? If all you've got is duty, a friend of mine by the name of Kay Allen, he's from Denver. He used to be Speaker of the House in Utah, but he's moved to Denver a number of years ago. He does a thing like this. I want a little more angle on this. He said there are 3 basic ways of looking at work and your family relationships, and one is fear and anxiety. These are the people that are always on guard, or somebody's going to give them the shaft, somebody's about to do it to them, and if you don't look out for yourself, nobody else is going to do it for you. There's always somebody there. And the further into this you go, the narrower your life experience is. Then this is duty and honor. Well, I married the old bag, and by God, I promised till death do us part, and so I'll bring home the bacon, and to hell with her otherwise, but then I'll be there, you know. That's duty and honor, you know. I hate this job, but I get a paycheck, so I'll do that, you know, and all those kind of things, you know. And then there's love and trust. Now, in this context, you'll notice as you go up, your world opens up. and you begin to see things from another perspective. And I ran across something just the other day, is that depending on how I see what I see in my world, depending on who I perceive myself to be, and that when I perceive myself as a certain way, the only thing I see out there is that which confirms what I thought it was. Two friends of ours, Ken and Beth Huberts, he worked at Hewlett-Packard in Loveland for many, many years. I'm not sure exactly. I think he was he wasn't an engineer down in Loveland. He was, I think he was a technical writer, I guess would be the way you'd describe him. His wife was a school teacher. Last I knew, last school she taught was over in Windsor. But they got interested in the Russian people before the walls come tumbling down. And they went on several tours to Russia. They've been over there 8 or 9 times now. And we went over there with them 3 years ago. And before the Soviet Union broke up, they went over there with a group. And they were told, now, people they're afraid to talk to you, so you can't talk to people. And be careful what you say, because all your hotel rooms will be bugged. And she said, we decided to ignore that, and they would go off down side streets and visit with people, and they found the Russian people so warm and friendly and so willing to talk. And they come back and got on the bus again, and the other people, and the others told them how cold and indifferent they were, and both people, and I think honestly so, folks, I don't think one group was lying and the other wasn't, but each of them experienced what they thought they would see. And the one group told how anxious and afraid they were, the other group told how warm and friendly they were. Now, we went over there after the wall had come down, and of course we experienced, and we lived in a private home for a week. And of course we found the same intensity of wanting to know who we were as we were wanting to know who they were, but then it was a little different situation there. But it's really true that we see the world and then we find in it what justifies the position we take. So when you're coming back to choosing a different way, supposing you decide that this is a place of trust. See, the reason I say this is because, think about it. The body works better in this context. The body works better. Relationships work better in this context. Where did we get the idea that if I point out all your mistakes, that you would perform better? When I was chief of probation, I had to do the annual evaluations every year. You know, I don't know how they do them now. I'd be curious to see what you're doing now, but it used to always be, what are his major strengths? Was one line. Then you had a whole bunch of lines to list the major strengths. The next one was, what are his major weaknesses? Do they still do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just crossed this one out and said, what are his strengths that he has not yet capitalized on? I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. Every weakness you can name, excepting for one, I can show you that in the right situation it's a strength. So why should I call it a weakness, an imperfection, just because it doesn't fit this situation as well as it does this one? Every person in our office looked forward to annual evaluations. I'd like to know what my major strengths, my strengths are that I have not yet identified. Makes all the difference in the world. Lack of integrity. I don't know how to see the positive side to the lack of integrity. There probably is one, and I just haven't figured it out. And I need to tell you this in connection with what Laura and I were talking about during the break. And that is, should we be through by 6 or quarter after? Which? Okay. What I wanted to get at is this 42 years ago, I came to a place in my life where I realized that so much of my life was living up to other people's expectations. And I realized that even while I didn't go around lying to people, it wasn't me. I was always trying to meet other expectations. And the day came when I decided I would rather be honest and irreligious than to be religious and fundamentally dishonest. Now, since that time, I found out that's a journey. That doesn't happen all at one time. And incidentally, let me throw here parenthetically that I found out that junior high kids, almost every junior high kid, has already decided how honestly he can live his life. They have a pretty good idea whether you can be honest or not. And you see, our society teaches us that there's appropriate times to lie. We expect our government to lie to foreign countries. We generally accept lying, even though we have truth in advertising. We expect ads to be dishonest. We expect, while we get upset at our politicians for lying, generally speaking, I think most Americans feel like they have to sometimes. And you know why, typically why they have to lie to their own people? It's because you can't handle bad news. When I was chief of probation, I was told by the court administrator, he'd give me a rumor about what was happening. He says, now don't tell your staff, they don't handle this well. I told my folks every time. I told them what the rumor was. I told them to what degree I thought it was a rumor. And in 12 years, I never had, now I'm talking about 8 people, you know, I'm not talking about 3,400. But not once in 12 years did I ever see a rumor that I passed on misused. Not once. So, what I'm saying here is that if you are going to be in charge of your workplace and what you're doing here, you start out with what you choose to see. Are you going to, first of all, are you going to operate from here or here or here? If you choose to operate from here, you'll see plenty of stuff to be afraid of. By the way, one of the interesting concepts that has come up recently that's been hard for a lot of people to accept, and that is there are only 2 emotions, love and fear. And the resentment and anger and hurt and all the other stuff are just simply different descriptions of this. Love is all the other things. See, nobody really knows what love is. We just know what love does. Nobody really knows what love is. It's too big a concept. I might share this with you because it's very recent. Got a call on Friday from a friend of ours who I knew that for the last 12 years his wife had been battling with leukemia. They were both employed by Kodak until about 6 or 7 years ago, and then they, on one of those early outs, you know, they took advantage of that and left. And when I first learned to know them, they had already gone through what they described as the first year and a half of being angry and upset and frustrated. Here she was only 37, 20. They'd been married 25 years, and they really had a good relationship going. And here they find out she's got leukemia, and so they went through this period of adjustment, and then really come to terms with it. And when I learned to know them, they were just so ready to share how you can live in joy in the midst of very bad news, you know. Well, then last Friday, I got a call that she was in Poudre Valley Hospital in the process of dying. So Helen and I went over there to see them. And while she had accepted the fact that she was dying, she was frustrated with the process. And I said some things to her. I didn't know what they were worth, but the next day, soon after we left, her husband told us that she just seemed to reach a place where she let go. I think you'd call it forgiveness. If forgiveness means letting go, she did. And then everything changed, and they talked about what an amazing change especially in his view of what death was about. And then Dr. Model, the psychiatrist here in town, he's in charge of the medical services at CSU. He and his wife Debbie went to see them. And they come out, they told me that Debbie, Dr. Model's wife, told me, she said, I've been through workshops, I've been through stuff that I considered to be life-changing, but she said, I've never, ever been through anything that had such a profound effect on me as to be in a room where it seemed like everything had been stripped away excepting for love. And I think we've tended to look at love as sort of an emotional thing that goes with high school kids and a few people who love sports. You see, we use love in so many ways. I use love carrots, In my case, it's ice cream. And what we mean is I just want to devour it, See, there were in the Greek, there were three words, eros, from which we get the word erotic, which meant that I want to possess it. And then they had a word, philos, which meant mutuality, like you have in marriage. I love you, you love me, and we get along. And then there's the word agape, which means, or agape, one's the verb and the other is the noun. Agape, like that way or that way, which means to love because that's what you are. It's like this light. Its light doesn't care if it shines on cabbage heads or kings or people, because it's its nature to give light. And so this kind of love is, in the Greek language, meant to love simply because that's who you are. You love your kids even when they're being little snots, Perfect. Yeah, perfect snots, that's right. So what I'm saying here is that we have tended to treat this as though it's something for outside the workplace, and I say it belongs right smack dab in the middle of it. And not in a sentimental sense, although this does have sentiment. And by the way, this is a choice. It's like shooting baskets again. It's not something you wait to see it happen, you choose it. You choose that I will function from a place of loving my fellow men, believing that you are just as highly motivated as I am, no matter what your level of understanding of that is. And if I approach it that way, if I approach you as someone who's just as well motivated as I am, no matter how much difference there is in our understanding of it, then how I treat you will always be with respect and trust. Always. And if I don't, it's because I've stepped out of that and I have been looking at my fears, which I project onto people and things out in the community. So, I've done a lot of talking and I haven't given a whole lot. I intended to tell you the first. I'm open for questions, and some of you have asked them, but I am very open to questions at any point along the line. Are there any questions about this now? Yes?
Would you go back a little and massage a little more on this neuron concept and the habit?
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about, you're saying that the myelin sheath grows thicker with use along
Yes.
that route.
Yes.
Where are the neurons before we even take that route? Are they just in the half they're fashioning them by taking that first group and puts them all in a row, and then
The brain is the most amazing redundancy system that we don't even begin to guess what a redundancy system. And I've often wondered, we've been told, I'll bet you every one of you have heard somewhere at least 10 times that we only use 10% of our brains. And I say, it's a redundancy system. You don't want to have to use it all. If it's a redundancy system, that's why somebody like Brady can get shot in the head and a portion of his brain destroyed, and he can still manage to function because it's a redundancy system. But they're all there and they're in place. But this is what learning to walk and learning to talk and all that is developing those neuron chains with the myelin sheath. And then when we choose to use this one, when we become consciously aware, then with use, this sheath becomes the thicker, and with disuse, this becomes less.
what role does that mind sheath play then? Why does it get thicker?
I'm thinking of it in two contexts here. By the way, let me throw this in parenthetically. When people get drunk, this is a fatty tissue. A pharmacist told me this. He said this is what they learn in pharmaceutical school. He said the myelin sheath is dissolved. And that's why the staggering and the slurred speech, and because you have a leakage, shall we say, or there's not clean connections. And then from alcohol, unless it's from habitual drinking, the myelin sheath builds back very quickly. It functions. That's right, exactly. And fiber or organ specific in terms of its destination. By the way, it's only after it leaves the brain. Now, this means that, you remember I said that if you spend 2 to 3 weeks, this brings up something else. 3 times people gave me the book Psycho-Cybernetics to read. And each time, the first 2 times I got it, I thought, I don't want to read another book that reduces the brain to a mechanism. I just didn't want to see humankind reduced to just a machine. It's okay to be a machine, but I wanted to be more than that. But when it was given to me the 3rd time, I decided to read it. And then I'm glad I did, because he tells some fascinating stories, and I want to share, because I've had some of these experiences. Dr. Maxwell Maltz is a plastic surgeon in New York City. I don't know if he's still, whether he's died or not, I don't know. It's been quite a while since his books were written. And he noticed that when he did plastic surgery on someone's nose, he wanted them to reshape their nose, he was fascinated by the fact that when he took the bandages off, he'd hold a mirror up to one person and they'd say, "Fantastic!" He'd hold a mirror up to the next person and say, "I don't think it's anything different." And he couldn't understand why he did the same job. It was essentially the same operation, and one couldn't see it and the other did. Well, my own experience, this is out of my own personal experience. I had an attorney here in the county call me one day who had a son who had dropped out of college because his complexion was so bad that when he went to college, the girls wouldn't go out with him, according to his story. And he wanted his dad to pay for, I don't know what they call it when they sand your complexion, and try to smooth it out. What is it? Yeah, okay, that sounds right. And when he came, and he said, "I don't think he needs it." So he wanted to know if I'd talk to him. So when he came to the door, I knew he was an identical twin, and I decided the other brother came, because the one that came to the door had no pockmarks on his face at all. But I found out this was the right one. And as we got acquainted and got going, I took him up to the mirror and had him look in the mirror and point out to me the pockmarks on his face. Folks, he stood right there and pointed at them. I stood right beside him. I could not see them. I could not see what he was seeing. I am so convinced that what we choose to see is there, and then we see it in our environment. And that we can choose to see it differently. In fact, there's a book come out recently called To See Things Differently that we have a copy of at home. It's fascinating because it's pointing out that when you don't like what you see, the first thing you do is to choose to see something else. I know when I see we're videotaping this, and you know, I'll be very honest with you. I spent $16,000 to get this taped, and I thought it would be a marketable thing to do, and because I've given aspects of this, like what I'm doing here, over 900 times, and I thought it's time I videotape it and do that. And so I went through all this process of videotaping, and you know, in my mind, I know among many other things, one of them was I didn't think it was good enough at the time I did this. This is quite a few years ago. And I didn't think it was good enough, and you know it wasn't. In fact, it's such a poor videotaping that I'm ashamed to send it out. I use it for blank tapes. And I'm doing essentially what I'm doing right now. I'm adjusting it some to the audience, but it's essentially this. It's not too bad, is it? and it just amazes me how we see what we want to see out there, and then we experience it, and it confirms what we thought that was. And so the people that think that the world is a rotten place and you can't trust anybody, that's what they see, and they experience. It isn't that they're lying; they experience it that way. Those who deliberately choose, I'm going to see a place of love and trust. And at first, everything in your whole being says that's not so. Your whole being denies it. But if you understand that the CEO has made the decision and now the workforce is going to oppose it at first, because all of the patterns of thought are right down this channel here, that it takes some deliberate choices over a period of time. Now, in my own case, I made 3 decisions one morning. One of them was that I was going to be honest. Another one was that I was so mixed up that I couldn't propose to teach anybody anything. So since I was that mixed up, I was going to be a learner. And I also made the decision I would learn from anybody, young or old, rich or poor, male or female, drunk or sober. I'd learn from anybody. And about 10 minutes later, I had a flat tire, and I was changing the tire. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and a drunk came up behind me. 8 o'clock in the morning. You know he was a drunk. And this was in Dry, Mississippi. Dry, down on the coast, Dry, Mississippi was so wet that they painted the liquor signs on the sides of the buildings. Right within sight of where I had my flat tire, they had a sign up there that says, "If you drive your husband to drink, drive him in here." And it said packaged goods for sale here. They printed it on the menu. While we were down there, the governor of Mississippi came down to Biloxi, Mississippi, and got drunk and fell down the steps of one of the hotels there and broke his leg. Now, this is where I was when this guy came up behind me, and he wanted to know if I had a quarter for a cup of coffee. Well, that was back when coffee was a nickel. And I stood up, and I just made this commitment, you know. And so I said to him, I said, "Sir," I said, "I don't have a quarter." I said, "I can't even give you a nickel." I said, "I've got 3 pennies in my pocket." But I said, "I'm about to get this tire changed." I said, "You want to go somewhere?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I want to go to Gulfport." I said, "Well, that's where I'm going." I said, "Get in." So I'm going to have to tell you a story that you probably don't won't believe either, but when we got in the car, I said to him, I said, "Sir," I said, "I've never been drunk with alcohol." I said, "Would you mind telling me why you drink?" I said, "I've been told that people get drunk to forget, or they get drunk because they like it." I said, "Do you mind telling me?" And the tears started pouring down his face, and I guess he's what the AA calls a crying drunk, you know. And he drank to forget. And we went all the way to 12 miles to Gulfport, and when we got there, I said, "Well, this is as far as I go." By the way, I never said a word. I just listened to him for 12 miles. And when I got there, I said, "Well, this is as far as I go." And he says, "Well, me too." And he got out and started to close the door. Then he opened it up and he said, "Do you live here?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Could I come and see you?" And I was flabbergasted because, in the first place, I hadn't displayed my wisdom. I hadn't said something about how I understood about life or didn't understand. And I thought it was my job to go out and buttonhole people who needed what I had to give. And I give it up, and the guy asked to come and see me. I just was floored. By the way, it's been that way ever since. And I feel like when we make some of these decisions and follow through on them without letting the workforce deter us from that, we can be absolutely amazed at our power to change our circumstance. I used to tell parents when I was working with their kids, I said, "I'm going to empower your daughter." And a week later they'd call up and say, "Well, ever since you empowered our daughter, we've had problems we've never thought of before, you know." Well, it is true that when you first begin this process, there is a finding of equilibrium. That is, there is pendulums don't swing to the middle. If you have been holding your children or your boss or your employees tightly with the rope and you suddenly set them free, they don't swing down here and stop and be balanced. They always swing to the other extreme. And then they find it. I need to illustrate this a little bit more. In working with the DA's office, see, the DA, we were good friends, but we saw things completely different sometimes. And if we got a kid that was put on probation, my job was to explain to him what the probation rules were. Well, guess how probation rules are generally viewed, you know. Well, this is what you got to do now. You got yourself into trouble. Now you got to do this and this and this. And if you don't, why, we'll file a revocation report and send you down to the institution. That's the way it's generally approached. But I would go to them and I would say, "Lost your freedom, didn't you?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "You want it back?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "I've got 10 ways here that if you'll follow these guidelines, you can get your freedom back. You can get the police off your back, and you can get the courts off your back, and you can even get your parents off your back." I said, "How's that sound?" They said, "That sounds good." I said, "Okay, I'm going to give you 10 things to do that if you'll do them, you'll get your freedom back." So I'd go through the 10 rules. I said, "If you'll do this, you'll rebuild trust with these people." So when I'd get all done, I'd say to them, "Now, do we have an understanding that you are going to, we don't care what your parents think, we don't care what Paul Holdeman thinks, we don't care what the DA thinks. We're just going to protect your freedom, right?" "Yeah." His parents are sitting over there on the couch and saying, "What's this guy doing? That's our problem," you know. And I say, "Look, if you protect your freedom, how are your parents going to feel?" Well, you start looking at that, well, okay, because you're communicating with them and all that kind of stuff. So 2 weeks later, the kid goes out and burglarizes another house. So I go back over there. What's the kid expecting from me? Chewing. Yeah, chewing out. But instead, I go over there and I say, "Boy, I'm confused." He says, "About what?" I said, "Didn't we have an understanding that you were going to protect your freedom?" "Yeah." I said, I just don't see how burglarizing a house protects your freedom. Well, it doesn't. I said, well, that's what I'm confused about. I said, I thought you wanted it, and so we set it up that way, and apparently you don't. He says, yes, I do. I said, well, then explain to me, how come this happened? And this is what they will do. Not always in these words, but they will say, well, I was a damn fool. Now he's taken responsibility for it. See, this is no different than us adults. We do the same thing. We have agreements with our bosses, with our managers. My daughter was with a company where they worked out what they call governance, self-governance or something like that. And they worked all the rules out so that the employees worked out their own stuff. And then they cleared it with the management and did that. But the first time the employees goofed up on it, the manager said, well, it's not working, and they pulled back. So with these kids, I would tell the DA when he'd say, well, I was a damn fool. I said, now let's don't revoke him now. This is the first time he's taking responsibility for it. He now knows that he made the choice. I said, let's don't do that now. So I'd have to argue with the DA's office to not revoke his probation because now he sees, that doesn't mean there aren't consequences, but it does mean that we don't send him to the institution because in the institution, he has no responsibility. Everybody makes decisions for him. Incidentally, another Haldemanism. You can't know your freedom without making decisions. Decision-making is the process by which you learn to know your freedom. It's like parents say to me, they say, well, he's not responsible. And I tell them, I said, do you realize that your son can never know freedom saying yes to mama all the time? Your son can never know freedom if he's always complying with dad's wishes. It's not possible. Organizations could get very high levels of loyalty from their people if they... You know what I told my staff when I came? I said, I would much rather have you go out and goof up on something and embarrass me as chief because I didn't even know you were doing it than to have to be kicking you in the rear end to get you to do something. And they did embarrass me. I remember one time the DA called me up and he said, Paul, do you know what Lloyd did? And I said, no, I guess I don't. And I was already feeling a little bit defensive, you know. And he said, well, he came over here and he ripped me up one side and down the other, and you wouldn't believe what all the things he said to me. I didn't know anything about it. I mean, here, he's not even a supervisor, and he goes over there and rips the DA up and down one side and the other. I said, well, Stu, I said, apart from the way he did it, did he have a point? And he said, yeah. I said, why don't you and I settle that, and then I'll talk to him about the way he did it. So we did, and when I saw Lloyd, I said, Lloyd, I said, you know, you have a quality about you that I'll bet you could get more mileage out of. And he says, okay, Paul, what did I do wrong now? I said, well, I don't know if you've done anything wrong. I'm just wondering whether you've got a quality about you that, and I don't want to curtail it a bit, other than to maybe redirect it if it can give you more mileage. So we talked about the whole thing, and he says, you're right. He says, you're absolutely right. He says, I'll go over and talk to the DA and make it right, which he did. But the thing that I felt good about is that I told him this. I said, you see, you and I work together, and I'm the kind of a guy that's always smoothing the feathers down. Maybe I need somebody in my life who ruffles them up. Maybe the two of us working together are better than if you both did it my way. You see what I'm getting at? I'll tell you one thing, and this is about kids as well as adults. Let's talk about kids first. If you have kids, I promise you that the things that have given you the most difficulty have been their strengths, not their weaknesses. You can handle their weaknesses. It's their strengths that bug the hell out of parents. And one closing story to illustrate that. Years ago, a couple came to me and they said, we have 2 boys. The oldest one has been our difficult son. The second one has been so easy to raise. He's obedient and he's compliant. And I said, like what? I said, well, just like the other night, we went to the show, and when we came out, the oldest one was old enough to walk out. The youngest one was sleepy, and we carried him out. And in those days, we still didn't have the seatbelt limitation. So he said, we open up the back door, and Steve crawls in, and he stands on the seat right next to the door. And we say to Steve, now move over so we can put Rick in here. If Steve decides he isn't going to move over, Steve won't move over. We have taken him out of the car and spanked him, put him back in, and this kid will not move over. Now that's how difficult he is. But when they got into high school, if the whole senior class was out stealing hubcaps and Steve decided it was wrong, nobody persuaded him to do it. Rick, everybody else was. So who's the easiest kid to raise? Which one would you rather have? Now, that's kids. Now, translate that to adults, because the thing that I've learned that all the difference between kids and adults is that adults have learned to camouflage it more. That's the only difference. So, that's a lot longer answer than what you asked for, I'll bet you. Any other questions before we shut it down for this time? Well, good then, because I'm ready to go home, and I'll see you in 2 weeks, and what we'll do in the next session is I have 5 principles. This is what I call my CLERT theory. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that because I don't, as you notice, I don't do anything with notes. So when I first started giving this lecture, I made an acronym in my mind of the 5 principles of communicating with each other. And the first one starts with a C, and then L, U, R, T. Those 5 things, and it just happens to pronounce CLERT. And then when I'd get calls from the university, they'd ask me, would you come and lecture on your CLERT theory? I was always embarrassed because they thought that had a meaning. And it's just the way in my mind I had of lining it up, so I'd remember without looking at notes. Now, I would like to, before you go, I have here a copy of a fable called The Animal School. Linda, are you familiar with this? Yeah. I'm going to read it to you, then if anybody's interested in taking a copy, I made one for all of you. I'd like to read this whole thing to you. Just one page here. This is the closing statement, okay? This is called The Animal School, and it was written by Dr. G.H. Rivas, Assistant Superintendent of the Cincinnati Public School System. Is anybody familiar with it? Okay. Once upon a time, the animals decided they must do something heroic to meet the problems of a new world. So they organized a school. They adopted an activity curriculum consistent of running, swimming, flying, and climbing. To make it easier to administer the curriculum, all animals took all the subjects. Does that sound familiar? The duck was excellent at swimming, in fact, better than his instructor, but he made only passing grades in flying and was very poor in running. Since he was slow in running and he had to stay after school and also drop swimming in order to practice running. I don't think I read that very well. The duck was excellent in swimming, in fact, better than his instructor, but he made only passing grades in flying and was very poor in running. Since he was slow in running, he had to stay after school and also drop swimming in order to practice running. I guess I said that right. This was kept up until his web feet were badly worn and he was only average in swimming. But average was acceptable in school, so nobody worried about that, except the duck. The rabbit started at the top of the class in running, but had a nervous breakdown because of so much makeup work in swimming. The squirrel was excellent in climbing until he developed frustration in the flying class where his teacher made him start from the ground up instead of from the treetop down. He also developed Charlie horses from overexertion and then got a C in climbing and a D in running. The eagle was the problem child and was disciplined severely. In the climbing class, he beat all the others to the top of the tree, but insisted on using his own way to get there. At the end of the year, an abnormal eel that could swim exceedingly well and run and climb and fly a little had the highest average and was valedictorian. The prairie dogs stayed out of school and fought the tax levy because the administration would not add digging and burrowing to the curriculum. They apprenticed their child to a badger and later joined the groundhogs and gophers to start a successful private school. Does this fable have a moral? Good night. I'll leave this right here, and if anybody wants a copy, you're welcome to it.
Could we also have a copy of the